welcome to the deep dive. You guys really wanted to get into the weeds with this motion filed by the government in the case of United States v. Donald J. Trump. And honestly, it is fascinating.
It's not every day you get to really unpack legal arguments about presidential power, right?
Right. And the stakes are high. The government's trying to deny Trump immunity, and they lay out their argument in this really almost like a step-by-step way in their motion. It's like 4 parts, almost like building a case brick by brick.
Yeah, and they come out swinging,
Yeah.
Right off the bat, they summarize their case by saying, when the defendant lost the 2020 presidential election, he resorted to crimes to try to stay in office.
Whoa. Okay, so no mincing words there. So let's get specific. What are they actually alleging Trump did that was criminal?
They claim, and I'm quoting here, with private co-conspirators, the defendant launched a series of increasingly desperate plans to overturn the legitimate election results in 7 states that he had lost: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
7 states. Okay, so this is big.
Oh, it gets bigger. They go on to say that his efforts included lying to state officials to induce them to ignore true vote counts, manufacturing fraudulent electoral votes in the targeted states, attempting to enlist Vice President Michael R. Pence in his role as President of the Senate to obstruct Congress's certification of the election by using the defendant's fraudulent electoral votes, and when all else had failed, on January 6, 2021, directing an angry crowd of supporters to the United States Capitol to obstruct the congressional certification.
It sounds like a lot to unpack, but if you had to boil it down, would you say they're building their case around 3 main conspiracies?
You nailed it. They even lay them out numerically in the motion. Quote, "The through line of these efforts was deceit. The defendants and co-conspirators knowingly false claims of election fraud. They used these lies in furtherance of 3 conspiracies. 1. A conspiracy to interfere with the federal government function by which the nation collects and counts election results, which is set forth in the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act, ECA. 2. A conspiracy to obstruct the official proceeding in which Congress certifies the legitimate results of a presidential election. And 3. A conspiracy to defraud the United States by interfering with the lawful functions of the federal government by which the government collects and counts votes cast in a federal election."
Deceit, obstruction, interference, yikes. But accusations are one thing, right? What about the evidence? How are they planning to actually back all of this up?
That's where it gets really interesting. They're not just focusing on what Trump did after the election. They're going back further, trying to establish a pattern of behavior.
So they're saying this was premeditated in a way.
Exactly. They bring up public statements he made months before the election even. For example, there's this tweet from July 30th, 2020, where he says, and I quote, "With universal mail-in voting, not absentee voting, which is good, 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. It will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote."
Interesting. Especially considering, Trump himself voted by mail in that election.
Exactly. And they're using that kind of thing, that contradiction, to paint a picture of his mindset at the time. And it's not just the tweets. They also dive into his interactions with those state officials after the election.
Which is where that whole candidate Trump versus President Trump thing probably comes into play, right? Setting the stage to say he wasn't acting within his authority as president and all that.
You're one step ahead of me. But before we get there, let's get into the weeds a bit. Can you give me an example of the kind of pressure campaign Trump was running with these officials? So, the motion mentions making knowingly and fraudulently false statements to multiple public officials, and as one example, they highlight Trump's claims about there being more votes than voters in certain states.
Right, those allegations of dead people voting, more ballots than registered voters, all those claims that were being thrown around.
Exactly, and all those claims were repeatedly debunked at the time, both by election officials and in the courts. But the government isn't just saying these claims were false. They're saying Trump knew they were false when he made them, and that he used them anyway to pressure these officials into overturning the will of the voters.
That's a bold accusation to make. How are they planning to prove he knowingly lied?
They're bringing the receipts. The motion says they plan to call witnesses, including some of those same state officials, to testify about their interactions with Trump, the pressure he was putting on them, and the fact that his claims were completely baseless. They also bring up evidence related to those slates of fraudulent electors. Remember that whole thing?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Sure. So in several states, Trump's allies organized groups of people to basically say they were the legitimate electors for the state, even though, Biden had won.
Oh, right. And they sent those fake certificates to Congress and everything.
Exactly. And the government is arguing that Trump was directly involved in coordinating this whole thing as part of his plan to stay in power. They even connect it to the pressure on Mike Pence, claiming Trump wanted to use those fake electors to justify overturning the results during the electoral count.
Wow. It's really starting to feel like they're building a pretty strong case here. What else did you find interesting in the motion?
Well, a significant chunk of the motion is dedicated to Trump's January 6th speech and that tweet he sent about Mike Pence while the Capitol was under attack.
You mean that one where he said Pence didn't have the, quote, courage to overturn the election?
That's the one. They're arguing that this directly incited the violence at the Capitol.
Which is interesting, right? Because for so long, the conversation around this is focused on Trump's actions as president. But in this motion, they're really drilling down on his actions as a candidate, like drawing this clear line saying, this wasn't him acting as president, it was him acting as a private citizen trying to overturn an election. And that's not protected.
It's a fascinating legal strategy, and honestly, it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
This is already so insightful, and we haven't even gotten into the actual legal arguments about immunity yet.
So, yeah, picking up right where we left off with that whole candidate versus president thing, because now the government has to actually convince the court that, acting as a candidate strips away that shield of presidential immunity.
Exactly. So how does that work? Take us into the legal weeds here. How does presidential immunity actually work, and how is the government, using it or working around it in this case?
Okay, so the motion lays out two main categories of official conduct. The first one, and the one with the strongest protection, is, you guessed it, absolute immunity.
Absolute immunity. Break that down for me. When does it apply?
So basically, when a president's authority to act is totally unquestionable, like Congress can't even regulate it, that's when absolute immunity kicks in. And the motion actually quotes the Supreme Court's decision in Trump v. United States from earlier this year to back this up, saying, with respect to the first category of core official conduct, when the president's authority to act is conclusive and preclusive, Congress may not regulate his actions, and the president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution.
So if the president's power in a particular area is ironclad, absolute immunity protects them.
Right. But, and this is important for Trump, the Supreme Court already weighed in on this. Remember those allegations about Trump's conversations with Justice Department officials and the whole thing about threatening to remove the acting attorney general?
Yeah.
So the court said that stuff was covered by absolute immunity because it fell under that, conclusive and preclusive authority. But, and it's the big but, those allegations aren't part of this case anymore. They were in the original indictment, but the government dropped them in the superseding indictment.
Hold on, back up for a sec. Superseding indictment. For those of us who aren't, legal experts.
What is that? Oh, right. Sorry. It's basically like an updated version of the original indictment. Think of it like a legal document 2.0. They made some tweaks, dropped some parts, streamlined things a bit. And the important thing here is that the Supreme Court didn't say any of the other conduct in this new indictment. The stuff that's left is covered by absolute immunity. In fact, they specifically said the opposite. The motion actually says, and again, I'm quoting, the superseding indictment omits those allegations, and the Supreme Court did not find that any other conduct alleged in the original indictment implicated conclusive and preclusive presidential authority.
Okay, so no absolute immunity for the charges that are actually part of this case.
Huh.
Got it. But there's that second type of immunity, right? Presumptive immunity.
You got it. Presumptive immunity is where it's at for other official conduct. So actions a president takes while they're in office as part of their job, but that don't fit under that really narrow definition of absolute immunity. And in those cases, immunity is presumed, but it can be challenged.
Challenged how? What would the government have to prove to get around that?
So the motion, again, goes back to the Supreme Court's wording, stating that, quote, the government can overcome that presumptive immunity by demonstrating that applying a criminal prohibition to that act would pose no dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch. Basically, they have to convince the court that putting Trump on trial for this stuff wouldn't somehow, totally mess up future presidencies or prevent the executive branch from doing its job.
So it's not just about Trump. They need to argue that this wouldn't set some kind of scary precedent that undermines executive power more broadly.
Exactly. And this is where that distinction between Trump acting as a candidate versus Trump acting as president, well, that becomes super important.
Right, because their whole argument is that all this stuff, the pressure campaigns, January 6th, all of it, wasn't him acting as president. That was just him as a private citizen who happened to be running for re-election.
Exactly. And if he wasn't acting as president, well, their argument is presidential immunity shouldn't apply.
Okay, I see where they're going with this. But still, it seems like a high bar to clear. Like, convincing a court that a president can be criminally charged for things they did while they were literally in office, that's huge.
No doubt. And the government knows it. That's why they dedicate the entire next section of this motion to really carefully applying these legal standards to the very specific things they're using to build their case.
Well, you've definitely piqued my interest.
Okay.
So we've got this whole case laid out in front of us, who did what, why they did it, and we've looked at this whole legal framework of presidential immunity, which is, like, super complicated. But now the question is, can the government actually pull this off? Can they convince a court that Trump's actions aren't protected?
Well, they lay out their argument in Section 3, and I have to say, it's impressive. Like, they're not messing around. And they start with that one area where the Supreme Court already said Trump's actions were official. Those conversations he had with Pence about the electoral count.
Right, because that whole thing about overseeing the joint session of Congress, that's part of the vice president's official duties, right? But I thought the government still said they thought Trump should be held accountable, even for that.
They did. They argue that even though the Supreme Court said those conversations were officially part of his job, they can still fight that presumption of immunity. And their argument is kind of amazing when you think about it. They're basically saying that putting Trump on trial for trying to pressure Pence into, abusing his power to overturn the election, well, that wouldn't hurt the executive branch at all. In fact, they say it actually strengthens the whole system of checks and balances that the Constitution is built on.
Which makes sense when you think about it. Like, if a president could just pressure their VP into overturning an election and there were zero consequences, that basically throws the whole idea of a peaceful transfer of power out the window, right?
Exactly. And the government is all over that. They argue, and I quote, "The executive branch has no authority or function to choose the next president." Basically, they're saying the Constitution gives that power to the states and to Congress, and the president doesn't get a say.
So they're drawing a line in the sand saying the president has absolutely zero authority here.
100%. And honestly, it's a pretty strong argument, but it gets trickier when you look at everything else. The pressure campaigns on those officials, the speeches, the tweets. Remember, they're saying none of that was official conduct. So how do they get around the fact that he was literally the president when he did all that?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. It seems like they're walking a tightrope here.
They are. But here's the thing. They argue that when Trump was doing all that stuff, pressuring those state officials, setting up those fake electors, making all those public statements, he was acting as a candidate who was desperate to win, not as the president doing his job. They're separating the office from the man himself.
So, like, there are two Trumps. President Trump, who has to follow the rules and is protected by immunity, and candidate Trump, who can be held accountable just like any other citizen.
Exactly. And because all those things he was doing, or as candidate Trump, they're fair game for prosecution.
So they're saying he can't hide behind the presidency to avoid responsibility for what he did as a private citizen, basically. That's a really interesting strategy.
Right. And they get really specific to support this. Like with the tweets, they point out that Trump almost always used his personal account, that new at Real Donald Trump 1, to push those election fraud claims and try to influence Pence. But he almost never used his official at POTS45 account for any of that.
So they're using his own actions to argue that he knew he was acting as a candidate, not the president. Clever. But it all comes down to whether the court buys it. So what happens now? What are they actually asking the court to do?
So at the very end of the motion, they have 4 specific things they're asking for. First, they want the court to officially say that they successfully argued against immunity for those conversations with Pence. Second, they want the court to agree that all that other stuff, none of it was official conduct. Third, they want the court to rule that Trump has to go to trial based on this new indictment. And finally, they want permission to use all that evidence they laid out in this motion at trial.
So basically they're saying, we've shown you what we've got, we think it's a strong case, and now it's time to go to trial.
Exactly. And, you said it earlier, the case is about way more than just Trump or even this one election. This is about the future of the presidency itself.
Absolutely. Accountability, the limits of power, whether a president can be held responsible for potentially breaking the law while in office. It brings up so many questions we're going to be grappling with for years to come. Wow, this deep dive has been incredible, and we've only scratched the surface. What do you all think about all this? Let us know your take on this, because this is a conversation that affects all of us. And until next time, happy diving.